Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, your history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, today's video came recommended over on Discord by Joe. The video is titled, What They Don't Teach You About Native Americans. Now, this is from a channel I've never heard of. It's called Elephants in Rooms, Ken LaCorte. No idea what the background is, so I get to go into it totally fresh. The video is doing really well. In less than a week, it's got 600,000 views. So I don't know if we got something like spicy, a hot take or something, or likely just gave a lot of engagement. The original video is going to be linked down below, so you can support that. If you like it, make sure to sub to their channel. By the way, sub to my originals channel. Just recently started. We're building it up. It's got a lot of fun, scripted content, some thought-provoking alternate history. The link to Mr. Terry Originals is down below. Let's get started. All right, so I was thinking about the channel name Elephants in the Room, kind of the metaphor for like, hey, there's this big obvious thing here with us and nobody's talking about it. So I was wondering if that's kind of like the vibe of the channel. Like saying what no one else is saying. It makes sense with the amount of engagement I saw with, there's a lot of comments and all that kind of stuff. So we'll see.
For most of my life, I was sold a kinder, gentler version of Native American history. Noble chiefs,
probably
peaceful tribes living in harmony with nature, until greedy Europeans came along and wrecked it all with destruction and death. That's what they teach us in schools, and that's what Hollywood tells us. It even makes us feel good just for feeling bad about it. And at the surface level,
one thing that's interesting is kind of the difference. And I think when we get older, we kind of forget, which is like, what did we learn about history just from societal interactions? I'm not talking about like formal education, but just discussions maybe you'd see on TV or maybe in person. Then there's like the stuff like that you're assessed on in like school, coming from curriculums. Interesting thing as a teacher, when, I look at curriculums and have to go through them and teaching, there's a lot of interesting things that I'll find that's like not in curriculums, but it's things that like people will say, I was taught this or I was learned this. And sometimes when you talk, a little bit further, people will kind of actually forget when like pressed upon, like, was this actually something institutionally taught in a way that is assessed or something I just learned? I just, often we just like assume it was taught in school. That was always kind of interesting when I actually look at the curriculum and a lot of misconceptions, that we believe in history and how often that's actually like not found in curriculums. That's where historiography is important. You can actually look at old curriculums. And again, you probably have to do, decades and decades and decades old, right? And that is interesting to see.
It makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, Indians once ruled North America. They were here first, and now they're largely gone, confined to reservations that have a whole lot of problems. They're not a visible part of the United States, and that essentially defines genocide. But as I dug into the history of North American warfare, that neat good guys versus bad guys story fell apart. The scalping, torture, and Indian village massacres, they were common in North America long before the first white people showed up.
Sure. Every continent's history is a history of struggle. Civilizations come and go. History's full of atrocities. How did the states of today around the world, how did the different groups come into being? Usually by nefarious ways. It's hard, if not impossible, to find, heroes and true nobility in history. It's actually kind of frustrating when, I see those kind of narratives and arguments within communities of people that like history. Kind of like the great man history kind of thing, where it's like you're looking for heroes, and then you get to this part where you like compartmentalize their lives, where it's like, hey, these were these good things, and then these were these bad things. Then, trying to find apologetics for the bad things to make sure the good things shine. And I've always felt like we don't need to do that. Why can't we just have nuance? We don't need to be so desperate for, I guess, role models like from history. You know what I mean? Let's just be honest with ourselves. What do you think about that?
It's a violent world.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't make European settlers the good guys. The frontier was a clash of two brutal systems, and the result was a cycle of massacres and reprisals that stretched over hundreds of years.
Now, you might have also seen a counter narrative. I've seen this kind of develop too, that like the good guys, right? Because that's what, again, like I was just referring to the last pause, this idea about like the goal of history is to hunt for the good guys versus the bad guys. I find that's usually to validate your own presuppositions. And it's so dishonest. But of course, there were people back then, could be colonists, could be settlers, the want, of course, justify, themselves and maybe their actions that would otherwise be questionable to create a narrative of, I'm the good guy, you're the bad guy. Happens all throughout history, right? And was used in this time.
Nobody walked away clean from this one. I'm Ken LaCorte. I research uncomfortable topics and do my best to share
who
what
is
I
he?
learned, especially topics like this, where the truth has been whitewashed to the point of painting a false narrative. So let's dig into what I learned. And it's not about making anyone a villain or a victim. It's about understanding reality, even when it's awkward. We'll start with a look at America before Columbus.
Okay.
Then different...
Okay. I mean, it's a 19-minute video. Trying to do something like America before the Columbus is going to create so much oversimplification that it might be hard to do that depending on the scope and time period of who we're talking about. But let's see.
Values and clashing... We'll start with a look at America before Columbus. Then different values and clashing war codes of the two peoples. And if you...
So we have a problem here. We could have a problem here when you say the two people. There's not the two people. This is many different people. We'll see if the argument that there were a lot of similar attitudes, I guess, amongst the, largely countless amount of indigenous groups before Columbus.
Really want to see how powerful and terrifying native warfare became? You have to look at the Comanche.
Yeah.
So dominant that one U.S. general said war with them would mean complete ruin.
Yeah. The Comanche, that group, if you do know their history, is the one that's definitely the easiest to try to paint a narrative amongst groups far outside even the Comanche, because there was some brutal stuff going on with those guys. It actually ends up bringing a lot of tension that's going to get the United States and Mexico eventually kind of at odds with each other in the Republic of Texas and eventually Mexican-American War. There's an interesting kind of thing that happens with the Comanche woven into that narrative.
And finally, we'll take a look at the conflict's blood on both sides. Okay. So how violent was North America before Columbus?
Seems largely largely fair.
It was insanely brutal. We grew up thinking Indian life was buffalo hunts and corn harvest, maybe the occasional dispute with neighbors.
All right, how many people did the actually, they were not riding horses before the Europeans came in and brought them in. I assume that's going to be there. But yeah, Europeans brought in horses. Something that's kind of interesting is how quickly so many indigenous peoples became kind of masters of horseback riding, like pretty quickly within just like a couple generations. Really impressive, actually. By the way, if you didn't know, there are still wild horses around, especially on the Western U.S., ones that like got loose and then they just like populated and you kind of see them roaming around. It's actually kind of cool.
Indian life was buffalo hunts and corn harvest, maybe the occasional dispute with neighbors. But for many tribes, violence was the rule, not the exception.
I wonder if he's just talking about North America as well.
Young men proved themselves. If you were a boy on the plains, you didn't become a man by planting crops or building a home. You became a man by joining a raiding party, taking scalps. That was your resume. That's how you earned a wife, gained respect, built your reputation. Violence wasn't a last...
Again, it's going to depend on which group you're talking about.
That's how you earned a wife, gained respect, built your reputation. Violence wasn't a last resort, it was social currency. And this wasn't some once-in-a-blue-moon thing. Raids happened constantly, sometimes weekly during raiding season. Their captives, depending on their sex and age, they might get adopted into the tribe. Yeah. Or they might get forced into harsher slavery or tortured to death in public ceremonies that would make your stomach turn.
Yeah. The outcomes of, again, a lot of these raids and capturing, it really was incredibly diverse. Yeah, some got fully basically brought into the tribe. But then, then you have like traditional slavery. And also many times where captives were basically used as ransom. That's one thing, in this era that you could see common was, you got to like have something to be able to negotiate with other groups. And one of those could be, other people. You make deals to, hostages, essentially.
Some victims were burned alive. Others had fingers cut off one by one. Or they'd run gauntlets where the entire village lined up to beat them as they passed.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
That looks savage.
Wasn't that a Comanche one as well? Like those gauntlets? I'm trying to remember.
But to them, it was tradition, a way to test courage, both for the victim and the people watching. Scalping is a good example. Many people blame it on Europeans who definitely used it as a tactic. But it was around for hundreds of years. A scalp wasn't just proof that you killed someone. It was a trophy you could dance with or display or use in religious ceremonies.
The whole idea of like physical trophies from, victims interesting thing that is found in like many different continents around the world. Also was a way to, intimidate others. So gruesome to think about, isn't it?
Someone. It was a trophy you could dance with or display or use in religious ceremonies. The point wasn't just killing your enemy, it was humiliating them in a way that resonated with your tribe. And warriors didn't just target other warriors for scalping. Scalping a woman or a child, that proved that a warrior had broken through the enemy defenses and reached the heart of the village. In a culture built around bravery, that made you a boss. At Crow Creek in modern South Dakota, nearly 500 villagers were massacred in the early 1300s, with nearly all of the remains showing signs of scalping. Torture was another constant. It wasn't really about punishment, it was ritual. Captives, especially warriors, were brought back to villages and subjected to public torture ceremonies that could last hours, sometimes days. Women slashed at them with knives, kids threw burning embers at them. And the more stoically a prisoner faced the pain, the more honor he earned. With both the Europeans and other Indian tribes, the violence was cyclical, and one raid spurred on another.
Yeah. So what sometimes I call like retaliation ping pong. You see this in just the history of conflict and wars. Somebody does, something egregious. It's responded to with egregious behavior. And then it just goes back and forth and back and forth because nobody wants to be the one to have something egregious have happen to them, but then be the one to be like, okay, that's enough. Like everybody wants to end by doing, I guess the egregious thing. Nobody is willing to, take the last blow and then say, okay, it's over without a retaliation.
Other Indian tribes, the violence was cyclical, and one raid spurred on another. A death demanded revenge, and entire tribes got locked into blood feuds that lasted for generations. And the scale? Way bigger than most people realize. The Indian wars with other tribes and Europeans weren't just a few decades of clashes. They lasted for centuries and stretched across the entire continent. And there were genocides of entire tribes. The Iroquois fought the Beaver Wars in the 1600s, wiping out or pushing out dozens of tribes from the Great Lakes down to Ohio.
Yeah. Well, some of this stuff, things that can evade, result in atrocities, sometimes comes down to the profitability of it. Like in the 1600s, when Europeans showed up, one of the commodities back in Europe was fur pelts, especially like beaver pelt. So much in Europe, it was a high fashion kind of statement at that time. And many of those animals that provided that pelt back in Europe were hunted nearly to extinction. So like for Native Americans, being able to control lands and be able to like sell or trade, pelts was incredibly profitable at a time when you can use those profits to both protect yourself while at the same time expanding your influence. Often in history since ancient times, when we see places that geographically that are very competitive, right? There's a lot of different people that are vying for the same geographic locations because of the geographic benefits that they have. One early region that comes to mind is ancient Mesopotamia, right? Centrally located in the heart of an area where it's surrounded by places that are not very advantageous geographically, naturally becomes a target for competition. Therefore, those that are able to be successful there are going to be societies that are going to be very successful at things like warfare, including doing horrific things that made them successful in the first place, like a dog-eat-dog world of competition. So in those societies, you may have cultures that again have such an emphasis on things like, fighting skill, justifying things that might be seen as excessive barbarity. Because unfortunately for the ones that don't, they get defeated, they get wiped off, and then they're gone from history. So having skills that make you brave and successful in combat are going to be sought after skills and also be respected skills, which is then going to infiltrate the politics and who is going to be the leader, right? You saw with so many Mesopotamian cultures, the king was also was somebody that proved themselves with their might in warfare. And that was like the key attribute to having a successful civilization, was having that type of king. Not necessarily one where the priority is, okay, I know how to manage finances. And that's going to depend on where you are in the world. Maybe somebody that's more economically strong in another part of the world, that is going to be a more desirable trait. In North America, you can kind of get some of those vibes there. Being successful in warfare is going to continue your people's existence. Because if you're not, you're gone.
The Sioux expanded west by brutalizing other nations. Now, I'm not saying tribes were mindless killers. They had sophisticated societies, complex diplomacy, incredible survival skills. But warfare was central to life for many of them, and it carried a brutality that shocks our modern sensibilities. Now, to be clear, the violence was widespread, but it wasn't universal. Some tribes were mostly peaceful at various points in time.
Okay, good. He's adding the nuance, which is great because the original framing kind of seemed it was painting this wide brush because, again, you're talking about millennia across an entire hemisphere. You know, the complexity and some of the other features you're going to see in the largest of the empires that exist in the Americas. Head down to the Aztec Empire, which has tens of millions of people in it. Incredible amounts of violence, but at the same time had very sophisticated social systems with education, advancements in math and literacy and astronomy, architecture. But that doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to have the violent natures. Those aren't mutually exclusive kind of things.
But when Spain, France, and Britain arrived, they didn't walk into some tranquil paradise. They walked into a continent of warring nations. Each European power tried playing the game, arming certain tribes, making alliances, using them as buffers.
Yep.
So the wars didn't stop when
alliances
they arrived.
are huge.
They got bigger.
Yep.
New weapons and alliances. They just poured gasoline on a fire that was already burning.
True.
And it would continue there for another 300 years.
If you didn't know, that's largely how the Spanish were able to defeat the empires of the Aztecs, which again, empire going to the 20, 30 million people, and the Inca in South America and having, you know, over 10 million people. But the military success came from alliances. You know, those empires had incredible amount of enemies that were more than willing to be allies with the Spanish and make up the fighting force. Hernan Cortez probably had 100,000 indigenous peoples that were made into alliances to defeat the Aztec power structure. French and Indian War, which will be coming up here, is a reason why the English called it that. England and their allies, France and their allies. But let's also not forget that the most devastating thing that happened with European colonization was disease. Probably 90% of indigenous peoples died of diseases due to a lack of immunity to those diseases as they had not been encountered in the Americas before. By the way, famously, you know, the Vikings that came around 1000, year 1000, came into Canada, into an area where they did not do well against indigenous peoples, got their butts kicked, and they're going to end up leaving and not coming back again. Was not worth to them.
Fire that was already burning, and it would continue there for another 300 years. Look, I'm a good researcher, but I'm not a historian. If I mess up anything substantial, let me know and I'll address it in the description box below.
It's fair.
Okay, so the Europeans had radically different value systems as well, including how they fought battles. When they pushed onto the frontier, they carried their old world rules of war with them. Armies wore uniforms. Governments declared war, and battles were supposed to be fought between soldiers, not...
Depends on if you're talking about these like imperial armies or not, right? Professional standing armies, because a lot of these were skirmishers by settlers that were not necessarily trained and organized in the fashion of national armies that existed at this time. So it depends even from that perspective what you're talking about with the Europeans or European settlers or people of the ancestry of European settlers.
Civilians. There were written war, and battles were supposed to be fought between soldiers, not civilians. There were written codes and expectations, even if they weren't always honored. Most nations followed the same basic rules of war, but it all broke down on the frontier. None of that applied in Indian warfare. And to colonialists, native warfare looked like what today we'd call terrorism. There were no declarations, no front lines, no formal campaigns. Raiding parties might ride out with a dozen men, hit a homestead at dawn, and quickly vanish. Sometimes they'd kill everyone, sometimes they'd take captives back, slaves or to be tortured. That was a shock to settlers. They came from a world where women and children were usually off limits. On the frontier, they were often the very first victims. Of course, to the Indians...
Again, that can be used as like hostage, as bargaining chips. Ransoms being the probably the biggest goal.
On the frontier, they were often the very first victims. Of course, to the Indians, European warfare looked baffling. Tribes saw colonialists line up in open fields, defend land and forts, and refuse to fight during the winter. They'd make treaties and break them, then they'd be shocked when their forts were burned down. Surrender? In most tribal cultures, it didn't mean mercy. It meant that you were theirs to be ransomed, enslaved, or killed.
Well, and that's why you have those bargaining chips. Why they would take them is if you want a more peaceful ending to a conflict, you're going to actually have to give something up other than just waving the white flag. It's like these hostages were trying to be used as like a currency for future peace. Or again, you still get in the infinite retaliation loop.
It didn't mean mercy. It meant that you were theirs to be ransomed, enslaved, or killed. The whole concept of a white flag was foreign.
Yeah.
Even the concept of land ownership was foreign. Europeans saw land as property. You could own it, fence it, farm it,
right,
pass it down to your kids. But tribes saw land kind of the way that we look at the deep ocean. Nobody owns it. You travel across it,
yeah,
hunt in it, move through it. You don't fence off a wave and call it yours.
Right.
So when settlers started carving up...
But don't let that confuse you with the idea of them saying like they have a land or they feel that, a land is sort of, I guess, theirs. European settlers, again, looking at it as a commercial thing, because that's what was going on in Europe. You had legal protections by the state of property, and that obviously didn't exist here in the Americas, as there weren't institutions created to do such a thing. Your land is what you could defend, and you basically had to defend it yourself because there were not institutions to protect it. So if, European settlers are coming in and saying, I have this piece of paper, that means nothing to somebody that doesn't have those type of institutions like Native Americans might.
Fields and saying, this is mine forever, Indians saw it as absurd.
Right.
They also had what Europeans would call magical beliefs in their daily lives and their approach to battle. Warriors painted themselves with sacred symbols, wore charms, and believed spirits made them bulletproof. Sometimes that gave them extraordinary confidence. Other times, it cost them.
Just like a European Christian might wear a crucifix or pray to God, for success and safety in battle.
Sometimes that gave them extraordinary confidence.
Sure.
Other times, it cost them. They could interpret small signals as a sign to press ahead when they shouldn't.
True.
Or even retreat from a winning position.
For sure.
Nevertheless, the European method of warfare was essentially useless.
You know what that reminded me of some of the battles of religion that came after the Protestant Reformation, where you had these, all these different groups splintering off their own interpretations of religion and what they think God means and what God is and what the Bible says and all this, and going in with this like incredible confidence that God is on your side and basically you just need to show up to be able to win, and then leading to the demise of you and your group. It kind of seems like it's the ones that relied on that less as some kind of supernatural intervention. The ones that relied on it less were the ones that end up being, more successful and being like, what actually matters is like tactics and technology. And for many of these European, armies, they had those things, but it doesn't mean the other stuff, the invoking of the supernatural and all that doesn't help, because it gives you confidence, but
you can't march in formation against fighters who don't stand still.
Right.
And when militias caught up to a war party, the Indians usually didn't fight. They scattered, regrouped later, and hit another soft target. Settlers eventually realized that if they couldn't adapt to that kind of warfare, they just wouldn't survive.
Right.
So they adapted. They formed ranging companies, small, fast units built for frontier warfare. These weren't polished soldiers in uniforms. They were trackers, scouts, gunmen who could move quickly and fight differently. Eventually, the biggest of these companies became known as the Texas Rangers.
So he's saying less of the imperial armies, which again just exist in that fashion, which again could be useful. There just weren't a lot of them. So adapting. Texas Rangers, you're going to see that in that region. That's where you're going to get the Comanche, by the way. And some of these groups, again, had to modify their approach. Otherwise, they're going to get annihilated. Because those groups, those Native American groups, they've been doing this forever. They're masters of it.
Reinvented fighting force. The shift was brutal, and now both sides were targeting civilians. Rangers learned to track like Indians, strike fast, no mercy. They burned crops to starve enemies into submission, and they took scalps as trophies.
The
very tactics
doing their
that
own
horrified
scalping
them at first became their standard operating procedure. Retaliation raids burned villages, destroyed their food storages, and killed anyone they found. By the
Retaliation ping
mid-1800s,
pong.
settlers were fighting without the rules they'd brought with them. That collision of one side's formal rules versus the other side's more civilian-centered violence, It created more cycles of atrocity and reprisal.
Well, you see why, they changed there, because the old ways of professional standing forces doesn't work here.
Again, every massacre justified another, and nobody even had a common framework for peace. Yet until the Europeans kept coming in greater and greater numbers, the Native Americans held their own, despite being vastly overwhelmed by technology and resources. And to really understand how effective they were, it makes sense to look at one tribe. Because by the late 1700s, the most feared military power west of the Mississippi wasn't England, France, or Spain. It was the Comanche.
Yeah.
And they came to define frontier warfare.
From what I understand, like all the other indigenous groups hated them. I think when the settlers were coming in, they're like, hey, I know we've got beef, but you guys haven't met the Comanche yet. So enemy of your enemy is your friend. Mexico had a hard time dealing with this, So, first it was the Spanish, and then when Mexico's there.
Their peak, maybe 40,000 Comanche controlled a territory the size of Texas, stretching into New Mexico, Colorado, Kansas, and Oklahoma.
That's a huge range to actually have control of.
They ruled the southern plains with such dominance that historians called it an empire. Not a centralized state like European powers, but something that controlled who lived, who died, and who owned what between the Rockies and central Texas.
I don't know if I'd give that the same definition of an empire. Empire is diversity of subject peoples ruled by an entity, but I guess there are elements of that. By the way, one of those groups that did start to really kick butt early with horses, European horses.
Turned the southern plains into an empire that demanded tribute from anyone who wanted to pass through. New Mexico settlements paid them off just to survive. Texas ranches lost thousands of cattle and horses every year. Even other tribes paid protection to the Comanche. The key to their power? It was the horse and their amazing ability to use them in war. When the Spanish brought horses to the Americas, most tribes saw them as livestock. The Comanche made them into fearsome weapons.
It's because there were no riding animals. No, there weren't even large domesticated animals to be able to use for any substantial level of work or anything like that. So seeing an animal like that has the abilities that a horse had was a new concept, but you could tell they came to that conclusion about how useful they would be very, very quickly and totally changing their whole lives.
Now, the Comanche were always amazing fighters, but horses just supercharged their abilities. They stole them, bred them, and learned how to fight from their backs with a skill no one ever matched, even since. Comanche warriors trained from childhood on horseback, and when they fought, some people just couldn't believe what they were seeing.
Sounds like the Mongols, doesn't it?
As they were riding at a full gallop, they'd hang down to one side of the horse under its neck. And from there, they could fire 20 arrows a minute and kill a man 30 yards away.
Dude, that's nuts, man.
All while essentially using the horse itself as a shield, so you couldn't even see who was shooting at you.
Dude, that's crazy.
It was a revolutionary tactic that no one else ever mastered. Yeah. But what made them so effective wasn't
sideways, that'd be scary.
It was a ruthlessness built into their culture. The elements I mentioned earlier were practiced by the Comanche in spades. Young warriors earned status by raiding and warfare. It's how you became someone. Again, violence wasn't a necessary evil. It was the path to everything that mattered to you. Historians call them the Mongols of the plains, and they were just unmatched warriors.
That totally sounds just like that. All right, glad I wasn't alone in getting those vibes. I love being able to just compare and contrast people in history. And you just find these things that are just common, that just come as a result of just the conditions of where somebody lives, added with the human decision element and seeing how those mix and how, again, those can be so common.
They were feared by everyone. In 1840, Comanche forces launched what became known as the legendary Great Raid.
Okay, wait. Sorry, I am pausing a lot, but I just wanted to appreciate, I guess, them wearing the big ol' hats at this time. Was that actually a thing that they wore those? I mean, I guess it would be, I don't know, you'd raid a place and you get their big old top hats. I had not actually envisioned that before. You think they found a way to do the sideways riding, but wearing the big old Lincoln multi-gallon hats?
They rode hundreds of miles into Mexico, destroying entire villages, stealing thousands of horses.
Mexico had such a problem with them.
North. The raids were so devastating that Mexico's northern frontier basically collapsed. I mean, Have you ever wondered why Spanish is the main language spoken south of the Rio Grande and not above it? If you had to choose just one reason, it'd be the Comanche Indians. Even
pretty reductive, but I guess it just shows that, what was the northern limit there for colonization. I mean, there were outposts and stuff that the Spanish had going up into California and New Mexico. But I don't know if I'll get into this, but this is also going to be an element for settlers kind of being allowed into this region, coming from the United States into an area that was, once Mexico, specifically with Texas and all the drama that's going to go in there. But that destabilization is going to pave also a path for continued settlement and colonization beyond a lot of the agreed upon terms that Mexico had given settlers to come into Texas. That destabilization definitely created more of a pathway for more settlement.
For them, though, expanding a population while you're on the move is difficult, and captives made up between 10 and 25% of their communities. Nearly every Comanche family owned slaves, mostly native or Mexican, and they were even traded at markets in Santa Fe and Taos, New Mexico. Some were adopted into families, while others were kept more as property, and the line between the two wasn't always clear. The most famous case was Cynthia Ann Parker. She was 9 years old when Comanches stormed into her family's fort in Texas, killing others but dragging her away alive. Like other captives who were young enough to assimilate into the tribe, she was given a whole new life, a new name, and eventually married a chief. It wasn't until 24 years later that the Rangers finally found her and freed her. But those events, they rattled Texans at the time because it wasn't some sort of joyous reunion. She didn't recognize her white relatives.
She was seen as a victim.
Their language anymore, and she certainly didn't want to be there. She screamed, resisted, tried to run.
I mean,
what to the Rangers was a rescue, to her was a kidnapping.
Right.
By then, her identity, her family, her loyalties, everything was with the Comanche. Texans saw her story as proof of Comanche cruelty, but they saw it as normal adoption into the tribe. She had raised 3 children, one of them Quanah Parker, who would go on to be the last and perhaps greatest chief of the Comanche Nation. The U.S. Army struggled for decades against the Comanche.
I didn't know that story.
Conventional tactics completely failed. Soldiers chasing them across the plains, they ended up exhausted, starving, and ambushed. One officer called it fighting shadows. Still, after many years, cracks started showing. Their population was dwindling as warfare and disease wiped out thousands. New American weapons, like the repeating rifles, they shifted the balance. And more settlers
good to be used, good on horseback.
Commercial hide hunters, backed quietly by the U.S. Army, were wiping out bison herds to starve the tribes. And in just over a decade, they killed nearly 30 million of them.
Pretty much go extinct there. One thing the indigenous peoples, pretty successful at was not, letting their hunting efforts just turn into the extinction of animals that were totally necessary for their survival, like buffalo were. But also once you start getting these, high-powered long-distance rifles, it made killing buffalo just so incredibly easy. Just perch up on a hillside. The buffalo just sit there and you can pretty much snipe them at a distance. And let's remember, too, how valuable those were as a economic commodity, similar to what we were talking about earlier with like the beaver.
In 1870, Comanche leader Quanah Parker launched a last-ditch assault on the trading post at Adobe Walls. It failed. U.S. Colonel Ronald Mackenzie countered with a brutal campaign and burned the Comanche winter stores. He destroyed villages and slaughtered over 1,000.
We're past the Mexican-American War now, too, though.
Starving and outgunned, the last Comanche band surrendered. Still, for over a century, the Comanche stood as the undisputed lords of the plains, and everyone feared them.
It brought a lot of drama between the United States and Mexico as well. Mexican government was very upset to hear that the United States also did trade with them. Stuff like getting horses from the Comanche, but then Americans would sell like guns to the Comanche. And that would keep all the violence going, there in what would, be Texas and northern Mexico. So it caused a lot of animosity towards the states, and Mexico blaming the United States for, a lot of that continued violence. But that destabilization too, whether intentional or not, the United States and a lot of the settlers definitely used that to their advantage in, going into Texas, settling the region and not abiding by some of the terms that Mexico had laid out for the settlement of that region. They were not successful in settling that region, but wanted things like renunciation of settlers, of their United States citizenship, conversion to Roman Catholicism, and other agreements. But again, because the Mexican government could not really enforce a lot of that because of, again, so much of the destabilization having to deal with the Comanche. It led to more and more settlement until you get to the point where, you know, Texas is largely just run by now these settlers. And then you get them declaring their independence and creating the Texas Republic, which lasted about 10 years and also paved the way for the Mexican-American War in the 1840s which will then lead to, you know, Mexico having to secede so much of the land that they could really never control, which on paper, you know, was double the size of what Mexico is now, but could not control those regions and basically had to give that up as a result of the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo.
Undisputed lords of the plains, and everyone feared them for good reason. Look, I summed up an empire in 5 minutes, but if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommended the book that inspired this video, Comanches, The History of a People. I read it years ago, and both the Comanche and the book stuck with me. In fact, it's the only book in my life that literally gave me nightmares. And once you see the frontier through its lens,
Frontier was scary, man.
Indian stories,
really was.
They look like children's cartoons. I have a link to it below. You know, most of us like our history, or any story, with clear heroes and villains. Good guys in white hats.
Yep. Stop doing that.
But the American frontier, it just didn't work that way. The brutality was universal. Again, by modern standards, almost incomprehensible.
Because the problem was like, you basically got rewarded for brutality in a lot of ways. Because there was no way to enforce reducing brutality. Might was right. It's like that, been like that in so many places in history that don't have a large centralization, you know, of rule that you can actually enforce this stuff. When that doesn't happen, that it just becomes king of the hill, you know?
I mean, I could tell dozens of stories from either side. Like when a Mormon militia dressed as Indians slaughtered 100 civilians.
Massacre.
Or when Tucson citizens and their allies killed over 100 peaceful Apache, mainly women and children. Or the Comanche raid on Fort Parker, where they gang raped women before killing them. Or the Minnesota uprising of 1862, when Dakota warriors killed over 600 settlers, including babies. And when it came to treaties, both sides broke them at will.
Yep.
To Indians, a treaty often meant a temporary pause to regroup for the next season's raids.
Because you couldn't enforce them. There was no enforceability of treaties. How could you? Simply based on trust, but good luck with that.
To Indians, a treaty often meant a temporary pause to regroup for the next season's raids. But their violations, they paled in significance to those broken by the Europeans in the United States. The United States federal government negotiated over 500 treaties and effectively broke every single one of them.
I don't know enough to be able to like corroborate or, you know, counter any of these type of statistics about how many treaties were broken by them and theirs. So if you don't see me interject with that, that's why. I don't know enough of the, I guess, data or statistics. So I'll leave you guys to that.
Negotiated over 500 treaties and effectively broke every single one of them. Yet the more you dig into it, it's still clear that neither side's narrative holds the truth. It wasn't about a noble civilization defeating savages, and it wasn't about peaceful natives crushed by evil invaders. It
did become part of the narrative for the whole Manifest Destiny, which was through this whole era, that there was a civilizing mission from the Atlantic to the Pacific that the United States, you know, engaged in at that time, which was a common theme in the basically imperialism of the 1900s, of civilizing missions, is to the benefit of the people there to come within the umbrella of this civilizing, whether it's the Americas or it's Africa, Polynesia, common thing globally at this time.
Two muscular cultures colliding until one had better guns and bigger numbers. Looking at those numbers, population sizes and estimates, they're really tricky for historians to figure out. I mean, especially when one side didn't keep a written history.
Right.
But pre-Columbus, the average native population estimate is around 10 million, although the range varies widely.
A lot more in South America. It looks like he is just talking about North America. It's a very different thing going on down there. We actually did have empires of central rule for over millions.
The European population, it was lower than that through the early 1800s before a massive wave of immigrants came.
Industrial Revolution.
Killed fighting? Well, deaths in the wars between Indians and Europeans, they're probably even harder to measure. Battlefield deaths especially, I mean, they're difficult to separate from things like starvation and disease because they're interrelated.
Someone knows a lot more about this is Cynical Historian. If you know him, he has a PhD in violence in the West. That was his dissertation. He's done a lot of work on the numbers of the violence, and having conversations with him, it was always really startling to know actually how violent the American West was. But yeah, Cypher, the Cynical Historian's got a lot of content on that.
But historians say that hundreds of thousands of natives were killed in the 300-year war, and likely tens of thousands of Europeans. Yet despite that violence, the primary cause of Indian deaths was biological, by a long shot.
Yes, I'm glad he said that.
The deadliest weapon, it wasn't torture, muskets, or scalping. It was something that nobody even fully understood at the time: germs. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and the flu were deadly to the natives.
We're not indigenous to the Americas. There was no cross-continental interaction. And the big killers, you know, we talk about things like smallpox and measles. Transmission of those, the development of immune systems, came from people living in proximity to large domesticated animals, things like cows or pigs or whatever, which had existed for millennia in, you know, Eurasia, but did not in the Americas, which is also the reason why it was such an uneven transfer of diseases, you know, in both directions, how it was so much in one direction, because again, domesticated animals, not much of a thing in the Americas. So you're not going to have those types of germs that can cause diseases transferring in that other direction.
For thousands of years, Europeans lived in dense populations near domesticated animals, where many of these diseases originated. Over generations, Europeans were repeatedly exposed to them, and their survivors passed on genes that gave resistance.
You know what else you can kind of think about too, as you're talking about this time? Basically, everyone in Europe is the descendants of survivors of the Black Death, right, of the 1300s. So in a lot of ways, that probably ended up eliminating eliminating those with weaker immune systems. So it was like a filtration of that. So yeah, you're the descendants of plague survivors. And it might have been helpful if you lived in the dirtier conditions. I tell my students, like, you know, you exist and your ancestry exists maybe because your ancestors were so gross they developed immune systems that were able to survive the plague.
Diseases originated. Over generations, Europeans were repeatedly exposed to them, and their survivors passed on genes that gave resistance. The native population had none of that. Right. And those diseases caused an estimated 60 to 90% of deaths among Native Americans. And despite one documented case in 1763, where British officers suggested giving infected blankets to hostile tribes, death by germs, it just wasn't intentional. It just happened. European settlers and armies saw these deaths
Yeah. I mean, mostly by accident, but
it's a military strategy, but as fate or God's will.
Right.
It was part of the overall conflict, which was a clash of civilizations that played out as a sustained personal feud where each side told itself the same story.
I do think that God's will kind of thing is interesting too, because obviously way before germ theory and, you know, how disease spreads, still like in an era where supernatural explanations for diseases was still like a common thing. So if you're talking about an era where people felt that there were competitions of, you know, whose religious beliefs were more accurate, who are the good guys, I guess you could say, they basically use that as evidence that, hey, these, you know, Native American peoples, they are, you know, the bad guys, as evidenced by the amount of disease that they're just dying from. Things like that were very easy to create as, you know, narratives.
We're the victims. They're the monsters. They started it and we're going to finish it.
Yeah.
The real story of the frontier is about cultures that couldn't exist, fighting a centuries-long war where mercy was rare and civilians paid the highest price. If you want to respect Native Americans, don't turn them into cardboard heroes or eternal victims, because they weren't. The truth is that they were powerful, resilient, and often brutal, just like the settlers who fought them. History just doesn't clean up nicely.
Yeah, that's fair.
And the more you dig, the dirtier everything looks.
True.
Although sometimes you don't have to look far back in history to see shocking things.
True.
Like, why are child soldiers so often used in warfare? When I dug into that one, I was really surprised to learn the answer, because it was that in many conflicts, child soldiers make sense. I mean, not from a morality point of view, of course,
Another video
but from a strategic one.
Yeah.
They bring a whole lot of advantages to the battlefield that you just wouldn't think of.
So tragic to see that, because I mean, child soldiers, I mean, they're victims, brainwashed and, you know, and forced into that type of I guess livelihood, which then gets carried around generationally.
It's a horrible but effective tactic. So there's an elephant in the room for you. Hey, I'm Ken LaCorte. Thanks for making it this far. I hope it was worthwhile.
Final thoughts. All right, if you've made it this far with me, thank you for going on this little journey with me. Hopefully you learned a lot. Hopefully I was able to add some, I guess, nuance to, or already nuanced arguments coming from, I forgot his name, Ken here. So overall, what do you think? I think the thing to come out of this, at least that I would promote, is I think try to detach ourselves from trying to use history as a weapon to, or as a justification to defend our own presuppositions or whatever our political or social goals are. I think it's largely dishonest and really abuses what history is supposed to be about, not a political or social goal, but just an analysis that improves critical thinking and an understanding of the world and how it works. So with that being said, let me know what you think. Again, this was the first time I'd seen this channel. If there is other content you think would be good for me to, I guess, comment on and react to, of course, let me know. You can let me know it on the comments, or more directly, put it in my Discord server where it'll be much easier to get to my attention. Again, before you go, sub to Mr. Terry Originals, trying to grow that. I think you'll really enjoy the content if you give it a chance. We'll see you next time.